Hi there, this is Dr. Eugene O'Loughlin and welcome to this lesson on problem solving techniques. In this lesson, we're going to examine SIPOC diagrams. So our objectives, first of all, at the end of this lesson, you should be able to do the following. Define what is meant by a SIPOC diagram, follow a step-by-step procedure for creating the SIPOC diagram, and then we're going to use the SIPOC diagram to describe an existing process as is, and I'll explain why we do that only. And finally, our objective would be to use the SIPOC diagram as a springboard to other critical activities in process improvement. So it's a brilliant tool, one of my favorite ones, but it's quite a high level tool and can be very, very useful when you're starting out in process improvement. So SIPOC diagrams are part of section 4 of our curriculum, process identification, and within this section we can see that it's the second of two techniques used for problem solving when we're looking at process identification. So as always in our lessons, let's start off with an inspirational quote. This one comes from the well-known author Mark Twain, and he once said, "The secret of getting ahead is getting started." The secret of getting started is breaking your complex, overwhelming tasks into small, manageable tasks, and then starting on the first one. So SIPOC diagrams can follow this almost to the letter. You'll see why in a moment. They are great ways of breaking problems down and also knowing where to start in your problem-solving processes. So let's move on. The letters SIPOC stand for the following: suppliers, inputs, processes, outputs, and customers. And it's an extension, you may have come across this, of the old computer system simple description of input, process, output. So before beginning a project to improve a process, we must first identify all the relevant elements of that process. And that SIPOC diagram is going to help us do this, and it's a good starting point. Throughout the process, the suppliers, S, provide input I to the process P. The process you're looking at to improve adds business value. This results in output O that should meet or exceed a customer's C expectations. So it's a really good tool for giving us a comprehensive understanding of various areas in the process that could lead to improvement and help us solve our problems. So when should we use a SIPOC diagram? Should only be used to describe the existing process as is and not the to be. It's not as useful for the to be process. So if we're looking at this, look to improve a process somewhere, a SIPOC diagram is a good place to give us the as is snapshot of how things are working at the moment. But it's a particularly useful tool when you need to answer these questions. What are all the inputs into a process? And I mean all the inputs. And then who supplies each of these inputs to the process? What requirements are placed on those inputs? And then look at the other side of the diagram. What are all the outputs of the process? And who are the real customers of each of these outputs? And what are the requirements of the customers? So this will give us a lot different look at a process than we might have come across before. So if you haven't come across SIPOC diagrams before, tune in here and learn a little bit more about them, because I think you'll find them very, very useful. So this is a high-level SIPOC diagram and how we draw this. So you can see the SIPOC is across the top here in brown, and we draw out the process separately, as you can see in a bluish color down at the bottom here. So let's see how we go and put a diagram like this together. And I really recommend that you do this following the step-by-step procedure that I'm outlining now. So we want to first of all, create an area that will allow you and your team to post additions to the SIPOC diagram. So a whiteboard or a flip chart is a great way to do this. And again, follow this step by step. We start with the process and we identify 4, 5, or 6 high-level steps. If you have more than that, consider breaking the SIPOC diagram down maybe into 2 or 3. If it gets very, very complicated if you have more than 6 or 7 steps in your process. So these are high-level steps. And the third step here is to identify, we then go and identify the outputs. So we start with the process and then we go to the outputs. It might sound as though you might, work from left to right and start with the suppliers, but no, start with the outputs. So list all the outputs to the right of the process box. And then once you've got all the output, identify the customers that will receive the outputs of this process. So remember, the outputs are of the process, and now we have customers. Who are the customers that get each of those processes? And then we move over to the left-hand side of the diagram, step 5 in my sequence here. Identify the inputs required for the process to function properly. And once you've done that and identify all the inputs, please, Then we want to identify, well, who are the suppliers of each of these inputs that are required by the process. So this gives you a high-level view over how a process works, and really, really valuable information. So let's take a look at an example to illustrate what we're talking about here. And the example I'm going to use is of prescribing medical medicines in a public hospital. And let's say the hospital authorities are looking to cut the costs associated with the process, and maybe they want to reduce errors or duplicate prescriptions that might occur, and they want to improve how medicines are supplied and controlled in the hospital. So the starting point for us is to create a SIPOC diagram. So as mentioned in the step-by-step procedure, we start by identifying 5, in this case 6 high-level steps to describe the process. So the first step is the hospital patient first meets with a doctor. The second step is then the doctor makes a diagnosis, and that's followed by the third step, where the doctor prescribes a particular medicine for the patient. And then the next part of the process is that the hospital pharmacist dispenses the medicine, the patient history file is updated, and the last high-level step in this process is that the medicine is reordered to maintain supply. So this is, as you can see, very, very high level, and the actual process will be a lot more detailed than this. But for the purposes of our SIPOC diagram, we don't want to have more than 6, maybe 7 steps in our process. And then, following our step-by-step procedure, we next identify the outputs. So the outputs of that process, we can see, well, there's medicine, tablets or a fluid of some sort, the dose, how many tablets that you take, the frequency, how many times a day do you take it? Are there any recommendations, such as only take medicines when you're eating, before eating a meal? The patient's history file will be updated. There'll probably be an internal payment request. And finally, a new order will need to be placed. So these are outputs of the process that we have identified. And then who are the customers of each of these outputs that you're looking at here? So customers on the right, outputs on the left. Customers are the patient, obviously at first, who's going to get the medicine, get the dose, get the frequency, and also get the recommendation. An administrator might be the person who will update the history file. Health authority may issue a payment request, and a new order, the drug company that supplies the medicine in the first place, will be the customer of the new order. So hopefully this is following along nicely for you here and giving you a different insight into process identification. And then we go over to the left of our diagram and we identify the inputs into the process. So inputs, obviously medicine, the original history file, and some guidelines and regulations which may come from regulatory authorities such as health boards and so on. There may also be internal procedures in the hospital to be followed, and training might need to be provided how these procedures are followed. So then we identify in the last step here the suppliers of these inputs. So the drug company is going to supply the medicines, distributor will deliver them, regulatory agencies might provide guidelines and regulations and procedures and so on, and government might also provide these informations to them as well. Training may well be provided by the drug company. So put all these together and we have our SIPOC diagram. So we can see in this case, our 6-step process, high-level steps identified across the bottom. And we have then next gone to the output. So this is the output box here, and we see we have identified all the outputs of this process. We then identified the customers of those outputs. We then went over and identified the inputs of the process, and finally the suppliers of those inputs. So this gives you, as I say, a different insight into how a process might work and might help you start to identify the process before you then go on to look at process improvement. So this is the as-is situation, and we can take it from here that there may well be things that we can do to improve this process. So when we have a SIPOC diagram done, we say that it could be a springboard to other critical activities for our process improvement. We could, for example, identify sources of variation or have metric identification, determine relationships between the variables or between inputs and outputs, generate improvement opportunities, and finally create control plans using this. So we're going to get you to do assignments in a separate section here. I'm going to get you to do a SIPOC diagram, in this case for 2 SIPOC diagrams, and one for the process of selling a new car. So this is from the viewpoint of the car salesperson. So what's the process for selling a new car, and what's the process for selling a used car? Now this is going to be different from region to region and country to country, because there's things like tax and excise duties and all those sort of things to be considered, which will be different from everywhere. I want you to use this SIPOC template and follow the correct sequence. It really, really does make a difference if you do it the way we talked about here. Compare your two diagrams and then see if there are any suggestions for improvement. So in summary, SIPOC stands for suppliers, inputs, processes, outputs, and customers. It's really useful for understanding the various areas in the process that could lead to improvement. It's great at describing the existing process as is. Remember, don't use it as to be in the to be one. And finally, it can and often does act as a springboard to other critical activities in process improvement. So that's how SIPOC diagrams are used as a problem-solving technique. I hope you found this video useful.